Yeah, okay, great. So welcome everyone to the keynote session of the Young Researchers Conference on Panorama of and the Pandemic, Literary and Cultural Responses. We have two chairs for the session this evening. Simi Malhotra, who is professor and head of the Department of English, Jamia Millia, Islamia, New Delhi. Her areas of interest include literary theory and popular culture studies. Her latest publications are the co-authored books Terrains of Consciousness, Multilogical Perspectives on Globalization by Weinberg University Press, 2021, and Ocean as Method, Thinking with the Maritime by Routledge, 2022, and the co-edited books Food Culture Studies in India, Consumption, Representation, and Mediation, and the last one, Inhabiting Cyberspace in India, Theory, Perspectives, and Challenges, both from Springer, 2021. We also have Ruchi Nagpal, who is a PhD research scholar in the Department of English, JMI. I now invite Professor Simi Malhotra to introduce our speaker.
I think Ruchi is doing that, Jubi. Yeah, right.
Thank you, Jubi, for that introduction. So this keynote would be delivered by Dr. Justin Winberg. Dr. Justin Winberg is Associate Professor in Department of Philosophy, University of South Carolina. He teaches and talks about questions in ethics, social and political philosophy, and meta-philosophy. In ethics, his work has been on a variety of issues, from theoretical questions regarding aggregation in normative moral theory to more everyday topics such as love, regret, offensiveness, and technology. In political philosophy, his focus has been on matters related to how idealized political philosophy should be, as well as governmental and non-governmental political agency. He is currently working on questions regarding philosophical disagreement. A very warm welcome, sir, and we look forward to your address.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks again for having me here at this conference. It's quite the honor. Approximately 6.6 million human lives around the world have been lost to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some people may look at that number and obviously be quite moved by the tragedy of it all, and conclude that humanity's response to the pandemic was a terrible failure. In fact, it's hard to look at that number and to look at all the disruption and cost and think, we have failed. At the same time, approximately 20 million human lives have been saved by COVID-19 vaccines. If you look at the development of those vaccines, the speed at which they were developed, the methods of distribution, despite problems with it, the way it was provided to many people free of charge. People might look at that number, 20 million human lives saved, and all the effort and scientific progress that went into that, and conclude that humanity's response to the pandemic was an amazing success, actually. So which was it? Was it a success? Was it a failure? If it was neither straightforwardly a success or a failure, which was it closer to? Was it more like a success? Was it more like a failure? When we ask a question like that, some people might think that this is a bad question, an ill-formed question. For one thing, it's imprecise. It makes use of a distinction between vague, poorly defined concepts. It's simplistic. And I agree that it's kind of a bad question. Nonetheless, it is a question that's probably worth answering. And part of my talk today will be to explain why I think it and many other questions that are similarly ill-formed are probably worth answering. And the other part of my talk will be about the difficulties involved in answering questions like this. By way of preview, at the end of the talk, we're probably not going to know the answer to that question in any more precise a way than we do right now. You might have a sense of what your answer to that is now. But I don't think that that's going to be a failure of the talk, because part of, I'd say, answering questions is only part or one kind of form of intellectual achievement, and sometimes coming to realize that there is a question there, or a question worth taking seriously, or what would be involved in actually answering the question is a form of gaining knowledge. So we're going to end up with some more questions at the end and some more difficulties at the end. But I think that that's probably going to be an improvement in our situation in terms of understanding how we should respond to this question about whether we've been a success or a failure here. The distinction between success and failure is just one of many kinds of distinctions we're often called upon to make and which have consequential effects. Some other examples we mentioned later in the paper. Now, typically when our actions have effects on others, those actions come under moral scrutiny. Morality seems to pop up very readily when our actions will have an effect on others. Yet, apart from a few minor examples, sometimes philosophy of science, there isn't much written on the ethics of making these kinds of distinctions, or the ethics of classification or taxonomy. I think one reason for this is that these distinctions, classifications, taxonomies, and so on, they seem like they're the kinds of things that are presented to us by the world, and all we have to do is just accurately report them. But as we'll see, some distinctions are not like that at all. Perhaps many are not like that at all. They're not handed to us. It's in some ways up to us what to do. And if it's up to us what to do, and what we will do will have effects on others, then it seems like we need to start thinking about the ethics of this, the ethics of making distinctions, which is why the talk is called The Ethics of Distinction. So what does it mean to have an ethics of anything? I think many of us think in terms of moral rules or principles we can apply, but that's not the only way to think about it. Perhaps eventually we'll come up with some good moral rules or principles that we discover are applicable to distinctions, to classifications, to taxonomies. But it may be useful to think of our project today more modestly, as simply articulating why there's this need for an ethics of distinction, to give us an example to explore and to point to some of the relevant elements of it. Now, I said that the question was humanity's response to the pandemic, success or a failure. I said that that's a bad question. I think we should turn to why that is. For one thing, it aggregates. It brings too many things together. And it does so without acknowledging this as a choice that we're making in framing the question, a choice that we might have problems with. So for example, it asks about humanity's response. Yet who is this humanity? There's no unified agent, humanity. There are collective agents, but humanity lacks the characteristics typically we typically take collective agents to have, such as cooperative intentions or shared goals amongst its constituents. So an orchestra, for example, might be a collective agent, or a cricket team might be a collective agent, but humanity is not. There's no set of coordinated agents which humanity could be reductively interpreted as. So we might talk about like how bad the traffic is or what the traffic is doing today, but that's just reduced to the drivers and so on the roads. But there's no set of coordinated agents which humanity could be reductively interpreted that way. Nor are there with humanity any identifiable representative agents whose actions could be reasonably taken to be a proxy for the whole of humanity. With governments as a kind of collective agency, we sometimes have representatives that, in a way, their actions could be taken as representative or as a proxy for the whole, but we don't have that for humanity. But we have our individual human beings, not just medical researchers or politicians considering pandemic policies, but ordinary people whose behavior, say, distancing from others or not, wearing masks or not, vaccinating or not, their ordinary behavior affected pandemic outcomes in various ways. There are also government agents, individual officials within bureaucracies and legislative bodies, the bureaucracies and the agencies and the legislatures, different levels of government within the same territory, different governments across territories, non-governmental organizations, charitable groups, hospitals, each of these things with their own aims. So lots of different agents, lots of different kinds of agents. Businesses also, the makers and sellers of medical equipment and various other products, any of which are directly or indirectly connected to the pandemic, but the supplier scarcity of which affected how the pandemic went, right? So we're talking about vaccines and medical supplies, but also things like paper products and some food items that people had difficulty obtaining during the pandemic. There are also businesses as employers choosing workplace policies for the people who work for them, choosing whether to have people in the office or at home, choosing how much to pay people, affecting employment and unemployment and so on. And all of these things, these multiple kinds of agents in various ways with various capabilities, goals, information, all working independently from one another and sometimes across purposes, make up this thing called humanity. So I think it might seem to be a mistake if we ask about humanity's response to the pandemic, if there are all of these different kinds of agents with all of these different kinds of aims, goals, capabilities, and so on. So there's a kind of tacit aggregation on agency in that question, but there's also tacit aggregation on the action side of things. So we might ask, well, what, if we're talking about humanity's response, we've just asked about what is this thing called humanity, but what is this thing called the response? Is the response lockdowns, quarantining, hoarding supplies, wearing masks, requiring masks, manufacturing masks? Is it developing vaccines? Is it funding vaccines? Is it approving vaccines? Is it getting vaccines? Is it refusing vaccines? Is it telling people to get them? Is it creating policy? Is it criticizing policy? Is it complying with policy? Is it failure to comply with policy? What's the response part of that that we're talking about? Excuse me. So the responses of varying sorts, and they're actually directly and indirectly opposing responses. So it seems, again, extraordinarily misleading to talk about humanity's response. There's aggregation along a third dimension as well, time. There's not one decision at one moment that characterized our response. Each moment presents a new menu of options available to us to respond to push harder in a particular direction or to change course. So talk of humanity's response asks about all of those moments without being explicit about doing so. So there's the aggregation elements along three dimensions there that contribute to making this question a kind of bad question. And then there are the evaluative terms that the question asks us about, success and failure. And as I mentioned, these are vague, but the problem is actually worse than that. We can call a concept vague when, despite having known, we can call criterial content for its application, we have trouble determining a threshold for it. So here's a classic example of vagueness, baldness. So when we say someone is bald, right, baldness has known criterial content. It concerns like the hairs on someone's head. So that's what it's about, okay? The vagueness comes in with the threshold, like, you know, does someone who has 20 hairs on their head still count as bald, or 200 or 2,000? By way of context, the average human head has about 100,000 hairs on it, right? But when does someone become bald, right? So that's the classic example of vagueness in the literature. We know what it's about, and we just have trouble with the threshold. But when it comes to success or failure, we also lack the criterial content. It's not just that we don't know whether we met some threshold in regard to it, because we don't have a fixed shared determinate sense of what the metrics of success or failure are. Is it number of COVID cases, severity of cases, deaths from COVID itself, or deaths caused also indirectly by COVID? So like a death that was caused by someone not having access to a hospital bed, and so they died of something else besides COVID because the hospital bed was taken up by someone with COVID. Is it number of lives saved? Is it cost per life saved? Is it a combination of some goods produced under various constraints, such as lives saved while not under a forced lockdown? So the question is not just vague, but it's ambiguous too. And different people asking what look like the same question may in fact be asking different things. So this question, has humanity's response to the pandemic been a success or a failure, is superficially, on the surface, a meaningful, reasonable question, but as stated, it doesn't seem like it actually is such a thing. It seems like it's a bad question for a number of reasons that I've just gone over. Now, it would be wonderful if, when we discover that a question is a bad question, we just stopped asking it. that would be nice. And sometimes we do. Like in academia, especially, like if we're doing our research or we're having conversations with people and we realize, okay, this is not a good question for various reasons. It's ill-formed, it involves a category mistake, someone else has already taken care of it. You know, there's all sorts of reasons why it might be a bad idea to take a bigger question, or a question might be bad. And in academia, we're okay with putting them aside, discarding them, revising them if need be, and so on. But much of the time in many other contexts, say in the real world outside of academia, bad questions persist. Bad questions get asked over and over and over again. And that they're asked and how they're answered can have real world effects. Why do bad questions still get asked? We might wonder. Well, sometimes people aren't sufficiently thoughtful about the questions they ask. I think it's no surprise if we look at the world and think, oh, people could be a little bit more thoughtful. Sometimes people aren't, well, sometimes asking the question is a means to achieve something else besides getting an answer to it. So they might use a question like that to score political points or rhetorical points, to direct praise or blame towards various agents. Individuals might do that, pundits might do that, news reporters might do that, politicians and so on might do that. And sometimes we just want to ask big questions like this one, aware of the risks that they're bad questions. So that the bad questions still get asked and asked publicly and sometimes answered publicly means that they're part of the set of social causes that affect how things go. They can affect policy, they can affect who's in office, they can affect what happens in the world, what we think, how we classify things, how things go downstream from them. Consider the question, like, suppose we imagine this guy, Sam. He asks, is Sam your ally or is Sam your opponent? Okay. That such a question is asked of us in a way asks us first to take sides. And then once we've taken sides, it affects how we interact with Samuel, how we hear him, how he hears us, the credence I give what he says, how I take his jokes, whether I find him sincere, believable. And once I start thinking in terms of the question, it seems like the answer to it can matter quite a bit. Questions like our question about this success or failure of humanity's response to the pandemic, questions like that persist and have effects. And if we're concerned with issues of political philosophy, of social philosophy, of moral philosophy, then it seems like the bad questions should be among the problems we think about, like other social phenomena. So, I mean, if we think about, we might be unhappy that questions like that persist, but that doesn't seem to be a good reason for us to not deal with them. Our question about the success or failure of humanity's response to the pandemic is politically salient. It's used by politicians as point scoring and blame games. It's policy salient. Whether we think of humanity's response to COVID-19 as a success or a failure will affect the extent to which and how we prepare for the next pandemic. It will affect not just questions of who gets to be in charge, which influencing people's votes for elected officials, but also our motivation for doing anything about the next pandemic, which strategies we take, which policies get repeated, which get rejected. Even the general attitude, are we resigned to tragedy in the wake of our failure? Or are we moved to keep up the good work that it took for us to achieve our success in the past? And those kinds of framings can have motivational effects that make a difference to what really happens. So we should take them seriously. And just because they're bad questions doesn't mean we could just ignore them. There are lots of things we're unhappy about, say the historical oppression of a minority group. That's an unhappy fact about society. Or voter ignorance, which is also an unfortunate feature of democratic societies. We might wish that these things were not the case. Nonetheless, democratic theorists take voter ignorance seriously. Political philosophers take historical oppressions of minorities very seriously. And I think we should also take the persistence of bad questions that have effects like this seriously too. So we shouldn't theorize as if these bad questions will never be asked or if they have no effects. All right, so what next? At the heart of our distinction then, at the heart of our question is this distinction between success and failure. And so how do we distinguish success from failure? How do we apply this distinction? How do we categorize efforts as successful or failures? How outcomes as successful or failures? there's certain features that this distinction has that I'll be drawing attention to. And other distinctions also have these characteristics too. And sometimes these distinctions don't always turn up in bad questions. Sometimes they turn up in quite reasonable questions in another context. So getting a handle on the feature of the kind of distinction at play between success and failure might be more useful than for just handling bad questions, although for us it comes up in the context of a bad question. Many of these features, as we'll see, are what contribute to the difficulty of figuring out what to do with these distinctions. So here's the first part. First difficulty, the distinction's evaluative. If I were given a collection of shapes cut from paper into either triangles or squares and was asked to distinguish the two, all I would have to do is count up the edges of each piece of paper to know how to sort them into different piles. And if I was asked, is this collection mostly triangles or mostly squares? All I'd have to do is, excuse me, add up the number of shapes in each pile to figure that out. If there's 7 triangles and 11 squares, well, this collection of shapes is mostly squares. Right? The distinction between triangles and squares is a purely descriptive distinction. What makes it such is that it's a distinction based solely on the characteristics of that which is being distinguished. Suppose I was given a bag of fruit and was asked to distinguish between the fruit that was ready to eat and the fruit that was not ready to eat. Part of what goes into this distinction are characteristics of the fruits, such as how ripe they are, but part of what goes into it might also be my tastes. Whether this banana is ready to eat will depend on it having certain characteristics. For example, just having some tiny brown spots. So it's in part descriptive, but what makes its possession of those tiny brown spots an indicator that it's ready to be eaten is my preference for bananas of that degree of ripeness. So here the distinction between ready to eat and not is not purely descriptive, like in the shapes case, but it's also partly evaluative. Similarly, the distinction between success and failure, that distinction is also partly evaluative. So that's one difficulty. It's not presented to us by the things themselves. Part of it involves the thoughts and attitudes of the one making the distinction. Note that the fact that a distinction is evaluative does not by itself imply that the distinction is up to me in the sense that I could simply choose how to make it. There may be a fact about me or my taste buds that make it the case that only bananas at a certain stage of ripeness will taste good to me. If I can't alter that, and I may not be able to, just some fact about me, then it's not up to me how to make the distinction. There's some underlying fact to which my distinction seems to be tied. But some distinctions are evaluative and up to me, because the underlying criteria admits of choice. Suppose, for example, that I'm having a party and I want my party to be good rather than bad. There are a variety of factors which might contribute to the party being good. Who's there, the physical environment, the atmosphere, the activities, the music, food, and so on. And for each of those factors, there's a bit of choice as to what counts as a good realization of them. One group of people might be more interesting, but another group of people I could invite might be more lively. Do I want interestingness or do I want liveliness at my party? Or when it comes to food, some food might be very sophisticated, right, and interesting. Others might be easier to eat while holding a drink. So what do I want? Do I want sophisticated food or do I want easy to eat food at my party? What's going to contribute, what makes for the better food at my party? Simply saying that I want my party to be good rather than bad doesn't settle or determine these more detailed questions. I have to do that. So what makes a good party good is at least partly up to me. This goes for after the fact distinction making too. So suppose my party is over and I ask myself, was it good or bad? To figure that out, I may end up choosing to focus on certain factors to weight more heavily than others, and for certain specifications of those factors to be the ones that really count. One way to put this is that the distinction is partly up to me because the distinction is between what can be called flexible composite concepts rather than rigid atomic concepts. To say a party was good is to be saying many things about it at once. Which particular things? Well, that's not determined by the concept itself. As we just saw, it could be determined by the person applying the concept. The same goes for saying that our response to the pandemic was a success or failure. It is to say many things about it at once, though again, we might not know which of those many things without further specification. So composite concepts are understood as having been built up from other concepts. And when a composite concept is a flexible composite concept, say flexibly composite concepts are built up from some underdetermined set of other concepts and can be multiply realized across different sets of concepts. Atomic concepts, by contrast, are not typically usefully understood as having been built up from component concepts. So compare triangular, for example, or yellow. So there's a sense in which triangular could be said to have been built up from polygons, sides, angles, and so on, and a sense in which yellow admits of some fuzziness around the borders. When using these terms, we typically needn't choose among which criteria to pay attention to. So we think of those as atomic concepts. But when it comes to what makes for a good party, the goodness there is a flexible composite concept, and likewise for success or failure of a pandemic. Another complication is that figuring out whether something was good or bad, or success or failure, is often a comparative exercise. Sometimes the comparison is to actually existing things or to events that have actually happened. So to know whom we should designate as the winner of a race, we just compare when the various competitors finished. Or if our goal is to build a bridge over a river, there's a sense in which if we end up with a bridge over the river, we've succeeded. Yet sometimes distinctions and classifications involve comparisons to things that don't exist or to states of affairs that have not obtained. We call these counterfactuals. So in assessing whether humanity's response to the pandemic was a success, it's not enough to know what happened. We know that 6.6 million humans died. That's bad. But that an outcome was bad is not sufficient for us to deem it a failure. We need to know what else might have happened if we had chosen differently among the courses of action available to us. What if, had we done anything other than what we in fact did, more people would have died? If that were true, then it would seem like that would count very strongly in favor of deeming our response to the pandemic a success. What if, had we chosen any one of the several alternative courses of action available to us, that would have resulted in half as many deaths from COVID than actually occurred? Well, that might speak strongly in favor of deeming our response to the pandemic a failure. So in assessing the success or failure of our response to the pandemic, it seems like it would be useful to know what other options were available to us and what the costs and benefits in the broadest sense of each of them were we to choose them. And that's an extraordinary epistemological demand. How are we to know all about that? We make, I don't want to push the point too hard, we make use of counterfactuals a lot in practical reasoning. If I revise a sentence in this paper, because I think it'll be more effective than if left unrevised, I'm making use of counterfactual reasoning right there. So I don't want to say that reliance on counterfactuals is either impossible or represents some insurmountable hurdle or is somehow irrational, but it is worth acknowledging just how much they contribute to the difficulty of answering the question. Okay, so far we've seen that our distinction between success and failure is of the following type. It's evaluative and not merely descriptive. It's partly up to me. It is a distinction between flexibly composite concepts, and it involves counterfactual reasoning. And these contribute to challenges in making such distinctions, so it'll be hard to do. But perhaps nonetheless, we can tackle the problem. Maybe we think, okay, this is a hard problem, but not an impossible problem. But there are still further concerns. So one very normal way to approach figuring out whether a concept applies to a situation or a state of affairs is to get more details about the state of affairs. That way we can make sure our application of the concept is accurate. So if I'm wondering, what's the weather going to be like today? It's going to be nice. Does nice apply to the weather today? Well, I could look out the window. That's one way of getting information. Or I could try to get more accurate information. I could check a detailed hour-by-hour forecast for the rest of the day on my phone. The app will tell me temperature changes throughout the day, precipitation, wind, and so on. And getting that extra information helps me figure out whether the label of nice applies. So more accuracy, more information can sometimes help in classification. Yet in our case of the distinction between success and failure, it's not simply a matter of accurate application. I mean, we can learn more details, right? We can learn about the severity of cases. We can learn about the demographic qualities of those who got sick and died. We can learn about the distribution of respirators, medicines, vaccines. We can learn about the origins of the virus, the economic harms of the lockdowns, the effectiveness of quarantines, and so on. We can add a whole lot more detail, get a much more accurate picture of what happened. It is unclear how much that by itself would help us answer this question. To see this, I started off the paper, recall, just by talking about the number of deaths and then the number of lives saved by the vaccines. But I could have started the paper with much more facts. I could have talked about all of these details I just described. And then we would still have this question about whether our response is a success or a failure. I mean, you could say, okay, well, you know, I just used deaths as the most, you know, because it's in a way the most significant and moving, you know, thing that perhaps, you know, for all of us that happened. But still, right, even if we listed all of the rest of the facts, we'd still have this question, is it a success or a failure? So accuracy and adding more information isn't actually going to resolve this question by itself, which is weird because we'd think, okay, well, this is a question that has to be somehow tied to the facts. Is it a success or a failure? And I think that's right. Reality is not irrelevant to our answer to this question about whether we have a success or a failure here. Words have certain meanings, and though those meanings change over time, they're tethered, if tentatively, if temporarily, to how the world is in some way. If we learned about the counterfactuals and discovered that all of our alternatives would have been much better in terms of number of deaths or cases, it would be very odd to call what we did a success. So we're somewhat bound in our distinction by the actual and by the counterfactual, but not tightly. We're not tightly bound owing to the evaluative aspect of the enterprise, its use of composite concepts, our ignorances of the counterfactuals. So we're in this weird spot, right? When we want to know how this distinction applies, success or failure, how it has to answer this question about success or failure, we're not strictly bound by the facts, but nor can we ignore the facts. So we're in this lightly tethered or somewhat tethered position. We have some options. We're not, the answer isn't determined by the facts, but nor. Right. So what can we do? Well, one option is consequentialist in nature. What this means is to basically to look at how good or bad the outcome of choosing one answer over another would be. So within the loose constraints just discussed, we could say we should make distinctions that are drawn in a way that will bring about the best consequences. So if calling our response to the pandemic a success would be better than calling it a failure, then we should call it a success. And if it would be better to call it a failure, then call it a failure. Of course, we need an explanation for why it would be better or worse one way or another. That would involve both a moral theory that tells us what's of value, or is it happiness, is it lives saved, is it health and well-being, is it peace, is it justice, is it respect? You know, we need some conception of that, and then some sense of what would happen were we to call it a failure, or what would happen were we to call it a success. Would it actually bring about a better set of consequences one way or another? That we would need a moral theory here isn't a special problem for our question. Whenever we're thinking about doing something because it would lead to better results, we need something like that in play, right? But it is something that needs to be in place. So is this consequentialist or pragmatic move the right way to deal with our question? I think there's something to this, but also something worrying about it. So the worrying thing is that we might think that it's too disconnected from reality, such that if we're just saying, look, label this in whatever way that would be for the best, we are not in some ways respecting the idea that we want some accuracy. Right? Even if we can't get 100% accuracy. Even if we're not completely tethered to accuracy, we might think this is pulling us too far away from that. Another might be that it's disingenuous or manipulative. We're not really describing what happened. We are in a way using what happened as a way of directing behavior in the future. If we can motivate people one way or another to lead to better outcomes in future pandemics or policy, by calling it a success or failure, we'll go that way rather than another way. And I think someone could say, well, look, it needn't be disingenuous or manipulative. It needn't be mere labeling that's in a way disconnected from reality. In making a distinction that isn't strictly determined by the facts, whether the facts are actual facts or counterfactual facts, we have some freedom to decide what to do and how to label. So it's not disingenuous in the sense that we're failing to hew to the true account of whether it was a success or a failure, because there is no true account of whether it was a success or a failure. We've already established that in some ways it's up to us. So it's not disingenuous in that way. So if we have some freedom to decide what to do and how to label, why not label it in a way that's for the best? And if part of labeling it for the best means labeling it in a way that will get uptake in order to produce the consequences that we want, then our labeling would have to be in some way respectful of how things actually went so that people actually believe it. So that's one way of thinking about it. We might think that such answers might be unconvincing or ineffective, but keep in mind these are answers for a world in which the bad question to which it's an answer is taken seriously. If the world isn't sophisticated enough to reject the question that we identify as a bad or ill-formed question, then maybe we shouldn't have the worry that it's going to reject the answer to that question. But that's, of course, a bit speculative. Alternatively, we might think that the possibility of using a question like this for the good means that the answers aren't all that bad. Maybe the questions, that the questions aren't so bad to have around. If we have started off thinking this is a bad question, but if people are asking this question and it can be used for the good, then maybe it's not a bad question to have around. So that's one possibility. I'm not sure I like that possibility. I'll tell you that. I think it's probably difficult to work out. It is hard to make questions go away. So here's a different kind of strategy. If we continue to think that the question is an ill-formed question, bad question, if we think that the challenges gone over here, the complications involved in answering the question make it such that it's very difficult to figure out how to answer it in an intellectually responsible way. If we think that the consequences of answering one way or another might be unknown to us or difficult to produce in a reliable way, it might just be guesswork, then we might think, okay, the consequential strategy is not going to work for us. What else can we do? So one thing we could do as a response is to raise more questions. It's hard to make questions go away, but it's easier to bring up questions. So perhaps one response to bad questions that involve distinctions like this is to add more questions that involve better distinctions and proliferate those, popularize those, and think about those. Now, the production of questions may seem like an odd way to respond to a question. We might think, okay, well, here's this thing we didn't know, and now we're just answering that question with a whole bunch of other things that we don't know. And I get that as a worry. However, on my view, I like to think of questions as forms of knowledge. When you come to have a question, that's new to you, you're learning that here's this thing that I don't know about. And if it's a new question, that's something that you didn't know about yourself before, or you didn't know about the world, that there's this thing that you didn't know about. It's sort of like discovering an island or hearing about an island that you didn't know about before, but not knowing about the island, what's on the island, right? If you learn that there's an island, you've learned something that you didn't know before, even if you don't know exactly what's on the island. Likewise, if you learn that there's some question that you didn't have before, you're learning something. Hey, there's this thing to be asked about. even if you don't know the answer to it. So you're in a way gaining a kind of knowledge there. So for me, if I were to think about what it means to have a good answer to this kind of question, it might be that part of that would be producing better questions and trying to promulgate those. That might be a way of responding to these kinds of distinctions, especially when thinking about it in terms of consequences isn't as determinate as we might hope. Of course, these are just a couple of suggestions, and I haven't produced really conclusive arguments for either one of these approaches, but I'm hoping that perhaps in the discussion to come, people have different views about both what we're supposed to do with these kinds of bad questions that come up in society, but also how we're supposed to make these kinds of distinctions when they have these characteristics of being in some way not determined by the facts, up to us, using these kinds of broad composite concepts involving counterfactuals and trying to use those distinctions to make sense of the world. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Dr. Justin Weinberg, and we're very, very happy to welcome Professor Baumlin, who's here. Thank you so much for joining. It's so wonderful to see you here. We eagerly wait for your keynote tomorrow, but I'm sorry, I saw Professor Baumlin and I wanted to just interrupt, but I'll let Ruchi take over from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Justin Winberg, for such a robust and ingenious session. We are totally grateful. And more than giving us a definition about how to distinguish, I think you have opened the floor to how we can talk about this idea, because our response to COVID, it cannot be this simplistic. I mean, we cannot talk in terms of success or failure, because that would be talking to actually or to statistically, like you said, and it should not be the case. And especially when we are talking from a very ethical perspective, right? And I mean, in general, our response to anything is anyways very complex, right? And to pandemic specifically, since we are talking about pandemic, it becomes all the more complex because there were so many factors that impacted everyone, right? And every response was very subjective and it was very singular. The way we, the emotional response of people, how they dealt in their personal lives, professional space, family issues, lockdown, and like you said, there are several factors. How do you this idea of how humanity responds? And what do we actually respond to? Do we respond to the pandemic? Do we respond to the quarantine situation? To this virtual space, which has become our new reality? To vaccination drives? What exactly do we respond to? So definitely it was a wonderful thing. And I love this idea that you said that the way we assess our efforts vis-a-vis this pandemic, it's going to affect our actions and decisions regarding future pandemics. So if we will be very strict about our response this time to this pandemic, then it's going to affect us later with all our decisions to pandemics and to problems. So we cannot be this specific or complete in our understanding of pandemic because it was complex at many levels, of course, right? So, and of course, so how can we actually analyze? So it's a complex thing, right? And of course, there's a lot of food for thought for us, so we can continue the discussion and we can keep debating around this idea that how actually we respond to this. So I wouldn't take much time. I would so these were my, this is what I I would this is with what I would like to conclude, and I would give the mic to Jubi because I'm sure our chat box is brimming with questions. So Jubi, could you please take up the questions?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Justin Weinberg. It has been a really fascinating lecture. And the fact that we are now looking at questions, in fact, for the lecture, it's pretty interesting. So I had a question for you, and then I think we'll also look at the chat box. Do you think a certain kind of subjectivity is involved when you answer a question like this? Plus, when you term something like when you term this question as a bad question, for example, if you're asking such a question to someone who has lost people in their lives in COVID, they would say, yes, it's a very bad question. How can you even think of the pandemic as being successful, you know? So what do you think would be, or how much impact would subjectivity have, or what would be the role of subjectivity in a context like this, especially when pandemic has become very intimate in our lives, you know, post 2020?
Okay, that's a good question. I think when we talk about something being a bad question, we could be using bad in a whole bunch of different ways, right? So when I talked about has humanity's response to the pandemic been a success or a failure, that being a bad question, I was talking about it largely in terms of how answerable is it, or what's the quality of the kinds of answers that we could get from that question. It's either not that answerable, or the kinds of answers we get don't on the face of it seem like they would be all that useful. But as you point out in your question, there's another way in which that question could be thought of as bad, in the way that just insensitivity to people is bad, right? So I agree, like if I were to ask someone who had several losses of people during the pandemic, to say, do you think that humanity's response to the pandemic was a success or failure? They might reasonably be very upset about such a question and say, as you suggest, that how could I possibly contemplate that as success? And that is a way in which the question could be bad. And maybe we should be on guard sometimes about the kinds of questions we ask, because of how people will feel as a result of being asked them. I think that's quite reasonable. And so maybe that is an additional way in which this question could be bad. But I do think we want to also distinguish between that and the sort of intellectual badness, right? Because we could say, if we were being very kind of cold-hearted to this person, and say, well, look, it could be that had we done anything different, many more people would have died, right? And while it's unfortunate that you lost some loved ones, it seems like this wasn't so bad compared to that. Like, if that were in fact the case, right? I'm not asserting that that was the case, right? And I think there's the emotional level, but I think at an intellectual level, someone has to recognize that that could quite be a possibility. As for subjectivity, right? I think the subjectivity comes in there, but it also comes in when we talk about how we're specifying the various factors that go into our assessment of whether something is a success. So go back to the example of a party, right? You want your party to be a good party. Well, what do you care about? What makes a party good for you? That's going to vary from person to person. So some subjectivity will come in there. Maybe you care more about the music than the food or something like that. So you can give that extra weight. Your differential weighting of the various criteria is going to be your element of subjectivity. There's no reason to think that those kinds of variations won't also apply to asking about something like policy responses to a public health crisis. Who's asking the question, or which group or which interest group or which stakeholders are asking this question might have different senses of which values are at stake, which metrics we're supposed to pay attention to, which specifications of those metrics are better or worse. So I do think subjectivity plays a role.
Okay, thank you so much. We also have a question from Professor James Baumlin. Are we assuming that human beings are rational agents who share a way of arguing, or do we assume that different responses derive from ways of knowing?
Well, I don't want to assume that human beings are rational agents with us in the success term of that, right? In fact, the paper in a way is premised on the idea that we're not, right? Because here's what seems like a bad question, and it persists. And lots of bad questions, not just this one, persist. And if we were being more rational, maybe we'd realize that this is not a particularly fruitful way of investigating our responses to the pandemic. So I don't want to put too much into saying that human beings are rational agents in the success. You're all rational all the time. We're certainly not. And there's wonderful literature across disciplines that point out to our various rationalities in interesting ways. Are there different ways of knowing? I mean, I do think that people will be paying attention to different things based on their context, on what's important to them. And absent some background framework by which we assess which values are more important than others, then sure, I think we should say, yeah, people are going to be better attuned to different aspects of various public events like the pandemic or basically anything based on various factors having to do with what they care about, which might be influenced by their background or whatever. And I think that generally speaking, we should be open to listening more rather than trying to set some high criteria for what counts as information worth paying attention to. I hope that got at your question adequately.
Yeah, I feel it did. We also have another question from Faizan. Thank you for teasing out the problematics of asking questions in terms of success and failure, Professor Weinberg. Would you suggest that one should do away with the evaluative categories of success and failure and think about other possible categories to make sense of humanity's response to pandemic? If that be the case, what would you replace these categories with? Any category one tends to work with would possibly have an evaluative interpretation in our intersubjective world. But can there really be a question devoid of evaluative interpretation?
Okay, so I think fundamentally, probably no, there can't be any question that doesn't have a sort of an evaluative interpretation, evaluative aspect to it. I tend to be empathetic to the idea that many of our so-called descriptive enterprises have evaluative components to it. There's a lot of nice work in philosophy of science that shows that it's not just epistemic values that go into shaping scientific inquiry, but sometimes moral ones, sometimes aesthetic ones as well. And so I think a more accurate and realistic picture of our modes of inquiry suggests that they're much more thoroughgoingly evaluative, or at least fundamentally evaluative than their PR might, their public relations might indicate. As for whether we should ever look at these broad categories as success or failure, or there are other categories, I mean, I don't want to dismiss thinking about things in big picture, broad strokes terms. I mean, sometimes it's super helpful to get that kind of big picture thing, and we don't always think that finer granularity gives us a better answer. I mean, if we think about discussing physical things, right? Here's a classic philosophical question. Is this table really here, right? Is there really a table there? Well, why is that a question? Well, because is there a table, or is it just really, the table is just this thing, a name for the atoms arranged in a particular way, right? And maybe what's really there are just the atoms arranged a certain way. So if we want to be super accurate and super precise, all we should be talking about is atoms. But if we limited ourselves to just talking about atoms and couldn't talk about tables, right, I feel like we'd be hampering ourselves rather than helping ourselves, right? Sometimes it's useful to be able to talk about the big picture, right? And I think that's probably true when it comes to more straightforwardly evaluative things like success and failure. Sometimes we do want to talk about that. That said, sometimes we want to know more details, right? And I think that when it comes to success or failure with the pandemic, I mean, the various kinds of things we might pay attention to, some of them were some of the more specific things I listed in the paper, not just number of deaths, but we were talking about cost. There's a lot of social science that's been done to produce this, and a lot of it's ignored by the public, right? These more finer grained questions. Yeah, so I'm not sure I have more to add apart from here are all these social scientific facts about the pandemic that people have looked into, and it seems like we could probably learn by looking at each of those.
Right. Thank you so much for answering that question. Professor Weinberg, I also have, I also had one comment to make. I looked at your blog on Disagree and even your podcast on Talk with the STOA, and it's very interesting when we think about disagreements and the nuances of disagreements, because when we think about disagreement, I feel it's a very, I mean, we don't really think about what all is the intricacy behind it. So I found that very interesting, especially in current times, as to, how do you disagree, or what would be the correct response to a disagreement. And I wanted to make that comment once. And also, yeah, I had one fine. Yeah,
Actually, if I may just speak to that for a moment, because I think there's a relevance to that and the distinction between success and failure and those kinds of things that involve like how we're going to classify stuff. So if I see you as a political opponent or a political ally, that's going to affect how I interact with you, whether I want to work with you in certain ways towards certain goals, how I hear what you're saying, how I interpret your motives, right? All that's going to be relevant there. So it might be super important for me to figure out whether you're an ally or an opponent, right? How might I do that, right? I could talk about like in these broad strokes terms, or I can try to like on a case by case basis, how much do we agree on? Like if we listed 100 propositions, how many of them would we agree on? How many would we disagree on? And it may turn out that we, at the more fine-grained level, there's a lot more agreement there. And it's just one or two things that we disagree over. And because we're focusing on the things we disagree about, we consider ourselves as opponents, and that in a way limits the ways in which we can interact, maybe hampers the way in which we communicate, makes things worse. If we could get better at figuring out how to label people as friends or opponents in terms of disagreement, we might be better off in a bunch of different ways here. So just as there's a kind of vagueness and broadness and complexity to the success and failure thing, I think that rides atop more specific facts. Likewise, like ally and opponent have that similar kind of structure, and the labels have a similar kind of import, right? So it's kind of important to figure out how we should think about people as allies or opponents, because they can have those downstream effects for better or for worse too.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Justin Weinberg, for indulging us with these questions and answering our questions. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Ruchi.
Thank you, Jubi. Thank you for moderating this session so smoothly. And now we move towards the official vote of thanks. So we come to the end of day one of our conference, and what a delightfully stimulating day it has been. I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Justin Winberg once again for taking out time for us and delivering the keynote, which has opened doors for several debates and discussions. Thank you so much, sir. We are truly grateful for your presence. And I would also like to thank Professor James S. Bromlin for joining us. He'll be delivering the valedictory keynote tomorrow. So we are looking forward to your talk, sir. I would like to thank the paper presenters who made this day and this conference possible with their enriching and noteworthy ideas. Thank you to our moderators and chairs and reporters for shouldering this conference and allowing us to run it smoothly without any glitches. I mean, it is because of them that we can relax during a session. So thank you so much. A big thanks to the audience for joining us, all the research scholars from the department and elsewhere, faculty members and students. We hope you had a wonderful time, and we hope you'll join us tomorrow as well. Thank you to Simi ma'am for all her love and constant support as we conceived and planned this conference. And of course, to my other two team members and dear friends, Stephen and Shananda, for always being there. We couldn't have done this without each other. So thank you, everyone. So we wrap up day one, and I hope to see you all tomorrow for day two as we begin at 11. So please join us tomorrow for another enriching day. We have a lot of papers lined up, and we have Professor Bomlin's valedictory address. So please join us tomorrow, and we call this a day.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Wendell. Thanks so much for that very, very special address. Thank you so much. I think Professor Bomlin has asked that can someone stay briefly to talk about tomorrow's lecture in its scheduled time. So let's stay on.
Yeah, ma'am.
Right.
Hi. So a quick question. I signed on in my time at around 8:40 a.m. and I didn't join at the start of his talk. Now, I was, the message I got was that the time that that my talk would start would be 9 a.m. So I think I might have to recalibrate that. Did they, if it started on if his talk started on the hour, then I think I need to join the session at 8 o'clock rather than my 9 o'clock. Does that sound right to you?
I think that is correct, sir, because we are following Eastern Standard Time for the US. That's what I sent to you. Probably there's a chance that you're at a different position in the US itself because they have different time zones.
I didn't think about the fact that we are on something called daylight savings time.
Oh,
And that means that I'm behind, and I apologize for not knowing, because I deeply wanted to hear his talk from the beginning, and I think I heard about half of it, and I apologize for that. Can I say I scrolled through your avatars, and I saw some wonderful, lively, intelligent, and young faces, and that's a glorious thing for an old man like me to see. And so I want you to know that the problem you're going to have with me is not getting started; it's getting me to shut up. So give me my next question. Give me, again, as firm as you wish, how much time do you want me to talk? And then how much time do you want me to shut up? Give me my talking time.
So the idea is of a 30-minute talk.
30 minutes.
Yes.
30 minutes, right?
Yes.
No,
Okay.
45.
No, 45 minutes plus 15
45.
minutes of
Oh, I just
question.
gained 15 minutes. I just got
Yeah, you
15.
just gained.
It is just that structurally we have kept it as a 45-minute talk with a 15-minute engagement of ideas, exchange of ideas. But then we are just delighted to have you on board, and you can talk as much as you want. I mean, that is not
Actually, I don't want to talk so much as I want to ask you guys questions. I got a bunch of questions that I want to throw out because I want to be Socratic about this.
Yes, sir.
I'm not, the thing is, I already know what I'm going to say. So me speaking doesn't help me. I want to be, as I'll say in my talk tomorrow, I want to be surprised. I want you guys to send chills down my spine by telling me things that I don't know. That's what I want. So I do have, if you're okay with this, I might be a little informal in posing to the people who are listening very specific questions that will turn what I would like to do into participation. Okay, so is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
All right. I think we can figure that out.
Okay,
We'll
I think we got it. Okay, I'm just wanting to make sure that I'm following the ground rules and I'm not violating what you have already established. Being the last person on, I'm in some respects, it would be easy to kick me off. You just turn off the thing, then you don't have to worry about me going in wrong directions. But by the way, allow me to introduce Rira Zamani to you. She is a colleague of mine. She's getting her doctorate in medical rhetoric at the University of Minnesota, which is one of the great doctoral institutions within the United States. She comes to the United States via Persia, and so she is much more familiar with your neck of the woods than I am.